The coffee shop went silent the moment the most powerful executive in the city raised his hand and struck a black female customer across the face in front of dozens of witnesses. He accused her of deliberately spilling coffee on his suit, a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to step between them, because everyone in that room understood exactly who he was and exactly what his name could do to their lives. Then the bodyguard standing just behind him noticed something small on the woman's wrist, a thin, pale scar curving along her skin, and his face drained of all color in an instant. The porcelain cup in his hand slipped from his fingers and shattered against the floor. And the words that came out of his mouth, next, froze the entire room. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking, "do you have any idea who you just hit?" The city outside the cafe moved the way it always did that morning, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding inside glass storefronts, taxis weaving through traffic, office workers clutching paper cups against the early chill. Nobody walking past that particular corner could have guessed that within the hour, the quiet street would become the center of a story that would dominate headlines for weeks. Stories like that rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive disguised as ordinary mornings, wrapped inside ordinary errands, hidden behind faces nobody bothers to look at twice. Maya Johnson was 34 years old, and on that particular morning, she wore nothing that suggested wealth or status. A plain gray coat, flat shoes, a leather bag, with a frayed strap she had carried for years. She walked into the cafe in the financial district the way she walked into every room, quietly, without expectation, without the need to be noticed. She had a meeting that morning, an important one, though nobody around her could have guessed it from looking at her. She ordered a simple black coffee and found a seat near the window, checking the time on a phone with a cracked screen, rehearsing in her mind the words she planned to say to people who held real power over funding she desperately needed for the people she served. She had no idea that within the hour, her face would be known by millions. Ethan Carter walked in 11 minutes later, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop the second the door opened for him. He was 45, the chief executive of one of the largest corporations in the state, a man whose name appeared in headlines about mergers and billion-dollar deals, a man who had built a reputation for being cold, exacting, and utterly intolerant of anything that wasted his time. He arrived with two assistants trailing behind him and a single bodyguard, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Webb, who had worked at his side for nearly a decade. Heads turned. Phones came out, not to film yet, but simply because people recognized him. Baristas straightened their posture. Even the manager came out from the back to personally greet him, because men like Ethan Carter did not wait in lines, and everyone in that cafe understood the unspoken rules that came with his presence. It happened in seconds. A young barista, nervous and rushing to refill a tray, collided with another employee carrying a fresh pot of coffee, and the scalding liquid splashed sideways, landing across the sleeve and lapel of Ethan's gray suit. He did not see the barista. He did not see the collision. All he saw was Maya, who happened to be standing closest to him, rising from her seat at that exact moment to reach for a napkin dispenser. In his mind, in the half second before reason could catch up with rage, she became the cause of the stains spreading across fabric that had cost him thousands of dollars. He spun toward her, his face contorted with fury that seemed disproportionate to a few drops of coffee, and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Maya immediately tried to explain that she had not touched him, that the spill had come from behind the counter, that she had only just stood up. She kept her voice calm, the way she had learned to keep her voice calm in far more dangerous situations than this one. But Ethan was not listening. He had decided, in the space of a single breath, exactly what had happened and exactly who was to blame. And no explanation offered by a woman in a plain gray coat was going to change his mind. His assistants froze. Marcus took a step forward, but did not yet understand what was unfolding. And then, before anyone could stop him, before anyone could even process what they were seeing, Ethan Carter raised his hand and slapped Maya Johnson across the face in front of the entire cafe. The sound of it seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Silence swallowed the room whole. A few customers gasped. Somewhere near the back, a phone was already raised, recording, capturing every second of what would soon become the most discussed video in the city. Maya's head turned slightly from the force of the blow, and for a moment nobody breathed, waiting to see what she would do, whether she would cry, whether she would scream, whether she would simply walk away the way the world so often expected women like her to walk away from men like him. She did none of those things. Maya straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked directly into Ethan Carter's eyes with a calm that unsettled everyone watching far more than tears ever could have. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten him with lawyers or cameras or consequences that sounded hollow in the moment. She simply said, in a tone so quiet that people had to lean in to hear it, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. Then she turned, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of the day unable to stop talking about what they had just witnessed. Ethan laughed it off. The way men who have never faced real consequences tend to laugh off warnings they don't understand. He straightened his jacket, muttered something about people who manufacture drama for attention, and instructed his assistants to find him a new suit before his next meeting. Around him, a few people exchanged uneasy glances, but no one challenged him directly. After all, this was the man who sat on 3 boards, who funded half the charity galas in the city, who could end a career with a single phone call. Most of the witnesses assumed Maya's parting words were simply the bruised pride of someone who had been humiliated in public, a hollow threat meant to save face on her way out the door. Marcus Webb, however, had not laughed. He stood frozen near the entrance, staring at the space where Maya's wrist had been visible just before she lifted her bag onto her shoulder. There, along the inside of her forearm, ran a thin, pale scar, shaped almost like a lightning bolt, the kind of scar that comes from something far more severe than an ordinary accident. Marcus had seen that exact scar only once before in his life, 15 years earlier, under circumstances he had spent a decade and a half trying not to remember. His chest tightened. The room around him blurred for a moment, as old images surged back uninvited, fire and smoke, and the screaming of men trapped behind a collapsed steel doorway. He moved quickly, catching up to Maya just outside the cafe before she could disappear into the crowded sidewalk. His voice trembled as he asked her a single question, a phrase that would have meant nothing to anyone else listening, a code shared only between people who had once lived through something unspeakable together. Maya stopped walking. She turned slowly and answered him with the exact response he had been both hoping for and dreading, the response only one person on earth could have known. Marcus's hands began to shake. He had spent 15 years believing the woman who saved his life had vanished without a trace, perhaps even believing she had not survived at all. And now she was standing in front of him on an ordinary sidewalk, having just been struck across the face by the man Marcus had sworn to protect. For a long moment, Marcus simply stood there on the sidewalk, watching the back of Maya's coat disappear into the flow of pedestrians, feeling 15 years of unanswered questions settle suddenly into place. He had built an entire career out of protecting powerful men precisely because he had once felt utterly powerless inside a burning building, certain he was going to die, until a stranger appeared out of the smoke and refused to let that happen. He had told himself for years that the debt could never be repaid because the woman who saved him no longer existed anywhere he could find her. Now she existed 2 blocks away, rubbing her cheek where his own employer had struck her. He turned back toward the cafe entrance where Ethan stood waiting impatiently for his ruined jacket to be replaced, completely unaware that the woman he had dismissed as a stranger, causing a scene, was about to upend everything he believed about his own life. Marcus walked back inside, his expression so altered that even Ethan paused mid-sentence to look at him. "We need to talk right now," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent in a way his employer had never heard from him before. Not in 10 years of crisis meetings, board disputes, or late-night emergencies. Something in his tone made even Ethan Carter, a man unaccustomed to being told what to do, fall silent and follow him toward a quiet corner of the cafe. Ethan's irritation flared the moment they were alone, his patience already worn thin by the ruined suit and the inconvenience of the entire morning. He demanded to know why his own bodyguard was making a scene over some woman who had clearly been looking for an excuse to cause trouble. Marcus did not answer right away. Instead, he asked Ethan to sit down, and something about the rare seriousness on his face made Ethan comply without his usual sarcasm. What Marcus said next would change the course of everything that followed, though neither man yet understood the full weight of it. 15 years earlier, Marcus told him, before he had ever taken a position guarding wealthy executives, he had worked as a rescue technician for the fire department, the kind of job that required running into buildings other people were running out of. One night, a manufacturing plant on the edge of the city caught fire after an equipment malfunction, trapping dozens of workers on the upper floors behind a stairwell that had buckled from the heat. Marcus had been part of the team sent in, and within minutes, the operation had gone disastrously wrong. Smoke thickening faster than anyone predicted, exits collapsing one after another. He remembered the chaos with a clarity that had never faded, no matter how many years passed. In the middle of that chaos, a young woman who had no business being inside a burning building had appeared from nowhere, guiding trapped workers through a service corridor that the official rescue maps did not even show. She moved with a calm that defied logic, pulling people through narrow gaps, carrying a child on her back, through smoke so thick that professional firefighters were struggling to breathe. At one point, a section of ceiling gave way, and metal debris tore across her forearm, leaving a wound deep enough that Marcus, even then, assumed she would lose the arm entirely. She did not stop moving. She kept guiding survivors out until every single person on that floor had escaped, and only then did she allow anyone to look at her injury. By the time emergency crews tried to find her name for the official report, she had already disappeared from the chaos outside the building, slipping away before reporters or officials could catch up with her. The story became something close to local legend among the people who had been there that night. The woman with no name, who saved an entire floor of workers and vanished before anyone could thank her properly. Marcus had searched for her for years afterward, quietly, on his own time, never finding a single solid lead. He had long since accepted that he would never know who she was. And then, 15 years later, he had seen the scar on her wrist in a cafe, moments after his own employer had struck her across the face. Ethan sat very still as Marcus spoke, something uncomfortable shifting behind his eyes. The name Maya Johnson, spoken aloud by Marcus, tugged at a memory he could not immediately place. Something connected to old files he had seen once and never thought about again, something tied to the early years of his father's company. He did not yet understand the connection, but a cold unease was already settling into his chest, the first crack in the certainty that had carried him through every confrontation of his adult life. Marcus finally looked his employer directly in the eye and said the words that would not leave Ethan's mind for the rest of the day. "The woman you just hit," he said quietly, "is the woman who saved my life." Ethan spent the rest of that day distracted in a way his staff had never seen before, snapping at no one, sitting in long silences during meetings that normally commanded his full attention. That night, he asked one of his most trusted assistants to quietly pull every old record connected to the manufacturing plant fire Marcus had described, a request that sent the young assistant digging through archived files that had not been touched in over a decade. What she found by early the next morning unsettled even her, and she brought the documents to Ethan's office with visible hesitation, unsure how her employer would react to what they revealed. The manufacturing plant that burned 15 years earlier had belonged, at the time, to a company owned by Ethan's own father, a fact Ethan had either forgotten or never fully registered as a young man more concerned with his own career than with operations at a single facility. The fire had nearly destroyed the company entirely, threatening lawsuits, insurance collapses, and a public relations disaster that could have ended the family business before Ethan ever inherited it. Yet the company had survived, largely because the death toll had been far lower than initial reports predicted, a fact attributed in internal documents to the unexplained intervention of a young woman who had guided dozens of workers to safety through a corridor nobody else had used. Ethan read through the documents twice, his hands gripping the edges of the pages as the full scope of what he was reading settled over him. If that fire had claimed the lives initially feared, the lawsuits alone would have bankrupted the company, stripping his family of the empire he now controlled. The buildings bearing his name, the board seats, the life he had built on a foundation he had never once questioned. He thought of every interview he had given, describing his own grit and vision as the source of everything he had achieved. Every speech in which he credited discipline and instinct for his rise, never once mentioning a fire, a stranger, or a debt that had quietly underwritten his entire career. Everything he owned, everything he had ever taken pride in, rested in some measure on the actions of a stranger who had walked into a burning building and walked out with nothing to show for it, but a scar she had carried in silence for 15 years. The deeper Ethan dug, the worse it became. Internal memos showed that company executives at the time had discussed locating the woman who saved the workers in order to offer compensation, perhaps even a public reward, both as a moral gesture and as good publicity for a company recovering from disaster. But the records simply stopped there. The trail abandoned. No follow-up documentation, no settlement, no payment of any kind ever issued to anyone matching her description. One memo, dated only weeks after the fire, noted simply that the search for the unidentified woman had been deprioritized due to more pressing matters. A single line that Ethan read over and over, struck by how easily a debt that large had been filed away and forgotten. Maya Johnson and her family, whoever had raised her, whatever life she had lived since that night, had received nothing. Not a dollar, not a letter, not even an acknowledgement that the company understood what she had done for them. Ethan sat alone in his office, long after his staff had gone home, staring at a photograph from the old company archives showing the burned remains of the plant, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to shame settle into his chest. He had spent his entire adult life believing his success had been earned through his own intelligence, his own discipline, his own relentless work ethic, and in a single afternoon he had discovered that the very ground beneath his empire had been secured by a woman he had publicly humiliated without a second thought. The man who built fortunes on confidence now found himself unable to look away from a truth he had never asked to know. Marcus arranged the meeting 2 days later, though it took considerable effort to convince Maya to agree to it at all. She had no interest in speaking with Ethan Carter, no desire to relive a story she had buried deliberately and carefully for a decade and a half. When she finally agreed, it was only because Marcus asked her as a personal favor, reminding her gently that some conversations, however unwanted, deserved to happen. She met Ethan in a quiet office, away from cameras, away from staff, and made it clear from the moment she sat down that she expected nothing from him and wanted even less. As the conversation unfolded, slowly and with visible reluctance on Maya's part, a picture of her life began to emerge that surprised Ethan more than the fire itself had. She lived modestly in a small apartment on the edge of the city, drove a car that was nearly 15 years old, and worked long hours that left little room for anything resembling the comfortable life her actions had indirectly handed to others. Over the years, she had founded a small nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting workers injured in industrial accidents, the very kind of accident that had once nearly taken her own arm. She funded it quietly, often using her own modest savings, never seeking publicity, never applying for grants that required her name to appear anywhere public. She told him, without any hint of self-pity, that she had helped thousands of people over the years find medical care, legal support, and basic dignity after accidents that left them forgotten by the companies that employed them. She never gave interviews. She never accepted awards, even when organizations tried repeatedly to honor her work. She believed, she said simply, that the moment her name became the story, the people she was trying to help would stop mattering to anyone, and that was a trade she refused to make. She described, almost reluctantly, the families she had helped over the years. A welder who lost 2 fingers and could not afford the surgery his insurance refused to cover. A young mother working night shifts at a warehouse who broke her spine in a fall, the company blamed on her own carelessness. Maya had sat with them in hospital waiting rooms, filled out paperwork no one else would help them complete, found lawyers willing to work for almost nothing because she asked them personally. None of it had ever appeared in a press release. None of it had ever needed to. Ethan listened in silence, increasingly aware of how small his own definition of success had been compared to hers. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Carter felt genuinely embarrassed, not because anyone was watching him, but because of who he had revealed himself to be in a moment he assumed would carry no consequences. He began to apologize, stumbling over words that did not come naturally to him, offering compensation, recognition, anything he could think of to undo what he had done in that cafe. Maya let him finish before answering, her voice steady and entirely without anger. I don't need your apology, she told him, and the words landed harder on Ethan than the loudest accusation ever could have. While Ethan sat with the weight of that conversation, the rest of the world had already moved on without waiting for his private reckoning. The video from the cafe had spread overnight, shared and reshared until it reached corners of the country that had never heard Ethan Carter's name before that week. Commentators dissected every second of the footage. Analysts speculated about what it meant for his company's reputation, and within 72 hours, his corporation's stock had dropped sharply as investors grew nervous about the public relations storm gathering around their chief executive. Journalists who had spent years covering corporate scandal recognized an opportunity too significant to ignore, and within days, a handful of reporters had identified Maya Johnson by name, tracing her connection to the small nonprofit she had built so quietly over the years. What they uncovered stunned even seasoned investigative writers accustomed to surprising stories. The woman struck on camera by one of the most powerful executives in the state turned out to be the same woman whispered about in old firefighter circles, the nameless hero of a manufacturing fire that had nearly ended an entire company 15 years earlier. Public reaction shifted overnight from outrage at a single slap to something far larger, a collective fascination with a woman who had quietly saved lives and asked for nothing in return, only to be humiliated by the very system her sacrifice had helped preserve. Headlines called her the forgotten hero of the city. Strangers who had never met her began sharing her nonprofit's information, donations pouring in faster than the small organization had ever seen. Talk shows debated the footage frame by frame. Editorial columns argued about what the moment revealed about wealth, race, and the assumptions powerful men carried into ordinary rooms without ever questioning them. Petitions circulated demanding Ethan's removal from his own board, while other voices, quieter but persistent, pointed out that real accountability would mean more than firing one man and moving on. Ethan, watching the story unfold from his office, understood that the consequences of that single afternoon had only just begun. It was during this surge of public attention that a persistent young journalist, digging deeper into the original fire investigation from 15 years earlier, discovered something that complicated the story even further. Old commendation records showed that someone else entirely had received official credit for the rescue operation that night, a name that had nothing to do with Maya Johnson. The journalist pulled archived newspaper clippings, award ceremony photographs, and internal company praise, all crediting a man who had not, according to every first-hand account Marcus and other survivors gave, actually been inside the building during the critical moments of the rescue. The man's name was Richard Holloway, a former operations director at the manufacturing plant who had, in the years following the fire, built an entire career on the reputation of being the hero who saved his workers that night. He had accepted a regional safety medal. He had received a substantial bonus from the company grateful for limiting its liability exposure. He had used the story in speeches, in interviews, in his own later business ventures, attaching his name permanently to an act of courage that belonged to someone else entirely. For 15 years, Maya Johnson had said nothing, had never once stepped forward to correct the record, content to disappear rather than fight for credit she never seemed to want. When journalists confronted Holloway with survivor testimony contradicting his long-told story, he denied everything at first, dismissing the claims as the confused memories of traumatized workers recalling a chaotic night imperfectly. But as more survivors came forward, each independently describing the same young woman with the same severe injury to her forearm, the cracks in his account became impossible to ignore. Marcus, watching the unfolding investigation with growing fury, agreed to speak publicly for the first time about what he had witnessed that night, knowing his testimony carried weight precisely because he had nothing personal to gain from telling the truth. Ethan, still working through his own complicated reckoning with Maya, made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than allowing his legal team to manage the unfolding scandal quietly behind closed doors the way corporations typically handled embarrassing revelations, he chose to use his company's resources to push the investigation into public view, funding an independent inquiry into exactly what had happened the night of the fire and exactly who deserved credit for what occurred. His advisors warned him that exposing a 15-year-old cover up connected to his own family's company could damage his reputation further. Ethan, for the first time, did not seem to care about that calculation the way he once would have. Richard Holloway, sensing the walls closing in around him, attempted one final desperate move before the truth became impossible to contain. He reached out privately to several former colleagues who had also benefited indirectly from the company's gratitude after the fire, suggesting that if his reputation collapsed, theirs would likely follow soon after. He reminded them of old favors, old silences, old agreements none of them had ever put in writing, hoping the weight of shared guilt would be enough to keep their mouths shut a little longer. One of those former colleagues, a retired safety inspector who had spent years quietly uneasy about the story everyone told, finally decided he was done carrying someone else's lie. "If I go down," Holloway reportedly told one former associate in a recorded conversation later submitted as evidence, "plenty of other people are going down with me." The threat, intended to buy his silence protection, instead became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him once it surfaced. The formal hearing took place several weeks later, in a courtroom packed beyond capacity, with reporters lining the hallways outside and cameras positioned at every available angle. Marcus testified first, his voice steady, despite the visible emotion he carried into every word, describing in detail the young woman who had guided him and dozens of trapped workers through a corridor that should not have existed on any rescue map. He spoke of the injury to her arm, the calm she maintained, while metal debris rained down around her, the disappearance that followed before anyone could properly thank her. His testimony, delivered without exaggeration or theatrical flourish, carried a weight that silenced the entire courtroom. One by one, survivors of the fire took the stand to corroborate his account. Men and women, now in their 40s and 50s, who had spent 15 years believing the woman who saved them had vanished forever without recognition. Each described the same details independently, the same severe wound, the same unwavering calm, the same refusal to wait around for thanks once the last worker had been guided to safety. One former machine operator, now walking with a cane, from injuries unrelated to that night, broke down in tears, recalling how the young woman had carried his coworker's child, the final stretch toward the exit, while flames licked the ceiling above them, never once raising her voice or letting the panic in the building reach her own face. Defense attorneys representing Holloway attempted to challenge the consistency of memories formed during a traumatic event, but the sheer volume of matching testimony made the argument increasingly difficult to sustain before the court. Documents obtained through the independent inquiry, Ethan had funded further dismantled Holloway's narrative, revealing internal company correspondence from years earlier in which executives privately acknowledged uncertainty about who exactly deserved credit for the rescue, choosing Holloway as the public face of the story, largely because he was already an employee in good standing while the true rescuer remained unidentified and unavailable for comment. The fabrication had not been a single lie, but a slow accumulation of convenient silences, each person involved choosing comfort over honesty until an entire false history had calcified into accepted fact. Documents obtained through the independent inquiry, Ethan had funded further dismantled Holloway's narrative, revealing internal company correspondence from years earlier, in which executives privately acknowledged uncertainty about who exactly deserved credit for the rescue, choosing Holloway as the public face of the story, largely because he was already an employee in good standing, while the true rescuer remained unidentified and unavailable for comment. The fabrication had not been a single lie, but a slow accumulation of convenient silences, each person involved choosing comfort over honesty until an entire false history had calcified into accepted fact. Holloway's own lawyer, midway through the proceedings, requested a private recess, later confirmed by courtroom staff to have advised his client that no remaining defense could withstand the weight of testimony already entered into the record. When the hearing resumed, Holloway's expression had changed entirely. The practiced confidence of earlier days replaced by the stillness of a man who finally understood there was no version of events left for him to control. By the final day of the hearing, the presiding judge ordered Holloway's arrest on charges related to fraud and falsified testimony connected to his original safety commendation, charges that carried the very real possibility of significant prison time given the scope of benefits he had fraudulently claimed over the years. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as he was led away, and for the first time in 15 years, the public record finally began to reflect what had actually happened inside that burning building. The truth, suppressed for so long through a combination of convenience and silence, had finally forced its way into daylight. As the hearing drew to its conclusion, the courtroom turned its attention toward Ethan Carter, who had been seated quietly throughout the proceedings, watching as the foundation of his family's success was dismantled and rebuilt before his eyes in front of the entire public. When the judge invited any final statements relevant to the proceedings, Ethan rose slowly and walked toward the front of the courtroom, aware that every camera in the building was now fixed directly on him. He began by acknowledging, without excuse or deflection, that he had struck a woman in public out of arrogance and assumption, judging her instantly based on nothing more than her appearance and his own inflated sense of importance. He admitted that for years he had built his identity around the belief that his success was entirely his own creation, never once questioning the deeper history of the company he inherited, never once wondering whose sacrifices had quietly protected the empire he so proudly claimed as his achievement. His voice, normally controlled and commanding in every public appearance, wavered as he continued speaking. In front of cameras broadcasting to a national audience, Ethan Carter knelt down in the middle of the courtroom and offered a formal apology to Maya Johnson, who sat in the gallery watching without expression. He spoke of the assistants who had watched him strike her and said nothing, the bystanders who had filmed the moment without intervening, the culture inside his own company that had taught everyone around him that challenging him carried more risk than staying silent ever would. He said he understood now that the silence in that cafe had not been about Maya alone, that it reflected something rotten that had been allowed to grow for years under his leadership, and that fixing it would require more than a single gesture in a courtroom. He announced the creation of a substantial compensation fund for workers and families affected by industrial accidents connected to his company's history, including a direct, long overdue settlement for Maya herself, 15 years late but finally acknowledged. He went further still, announcing that he would transfer a meaningful percentage of his personal shares in the company into Maya's nonprofit organization, ensuring it would have resources far beyond anything it had operated with before that day. The courtroom fell into an unusual hush, as everyone waited to see how Maya would respond to a moment most people expected to bring her some measure of satisfaction or vindication. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed closer. Even Ethan, still kneeling, seemed uncertain whether her silence meant forgiveness or something else entirely. Maya rose from her seat slowly, smoothing the same plain gray coat she had worn the day everything began, and walked to the front of the courtroom without hesitation. She did not look at Ethan with anger, nor did she rush to embrace the apology being offered to her in front of the entire country. Instead, she turned to face the gathered crowd, the reporters, the survivors, the cameras broadcasting her words far beyond that room, and began to speak in the same calm, unshaken voice she had used in the cafe weeks earlier. She told them that she accepted the apology, not because Ethan's words erased what had happened, but because holding on to anger had never been the kind of person she wanted to be. She thanked the survivors who had come forward to tell the truth, and she thanked Marcus, who had carried the memory of that night for 15 years without ever forgetting the debt he believed he owed her. Then she turned her attention to the wider audience listening, and her voice grew firmer, carrying the weight of everything she had endured in silence for so long. She told them never to judge a person by the color of their skin, never to assume the worst about someone based on the clothes they wore, or the car they drove, or the neighborhood they came from. She told them that the people who change the world rarely look like the people history chooses to celebrate. That quiet sacrifice almost always goes unnoticed, while loud, convenient stories get rewarded instead. She spoke briefly of the welder and the young mother she had mentioned earlier, careful, even now, not to use their real names, explaining that the world was full of people doing extraordinary things in ordinary clothes, and that the failure to notice them said far more about the people looking than it ever said about the people being overlooked. She reminded the room that a scar on someone's arm could mean nothing, or it could mean everything, and the only way to know the difference was to stop assuming and start listening. When she finished speaking, the courtroom rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than anyone expected, reporters included, many of them visibly moved by words that carried none of the bitterness they had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Ethan Carter began implementing sweeping changes throughout his company, instituting new accountability standards, funding worker protection programs, and personally reviewing decades of overlooked claims his corporation had ignored over the years. His transformation, slow and imperfect, became a frequently cited case study in business circles about what genuine accountability could look like when it finally arrived. Maya's nonprofit organization expanded rapidly in the months that followed, opening regional offices across the country to support workers injured in industrial accidents who had previously had nowhere to turn. Donations continued pouring in long after the initial media attention faded, sustained by a steady stream of people who had read her story and wanted to be part of something that mattered beyond a single viral moment. Marcus left his position guarding executives entirely, choosing instead to work alongside Maya full time, finally given the chance to repay a debt he had carried quietly for 15 years. He spent his days now driving between hospitals and work sites instead of boardrooms and private elevators, and more than one former colleague noted that he seemed, for the first time in years, genuinely at peace. Ethan's company released a public report 1 year later detailing the changes implemented since the hearing, including a dedicated department devoted entirely to reviewing historical worker injury claims that had previously been ignored or dismissed. Critics remained skeptical, pointing out that genuine change in a corporation often takes far longer than a single year to prove itself sincere, and Ethan himself never claimed otherwise in any of his public remarks. He stopped giving the kind of interviews that once defined his public image, the bold predictions, the confident sound bites, choosing instead to speak rarely and carefully, aware now that his words carried weight he had once taken for granted. Maya left the courtroom that day, without waiting for further applause or attention, walking out through a side entrance to avoid the crowd of reporters gathered at the main doors. As she stepped into the late afternoon light, a photographer caught one final image that would later be reprinted in countless articles about her story. Her sleeve pulled back slightly as she adjusted her bag, the thin, pale scar along her wrist clearly visible in the frame. Editors would later argue over which photograph best captured the story: the slap, the courtroom apology, or this quiet final frame of a woman walking away from cameras she had never wanted in the first place. And most of them eventually agreed it was the last one that mattered most. It was the same scar that had once caused her unbearable pain, the same scar that had nearly cost her an arm, and the very thing that ultimately forced an entire city, and eventually an entire country, to remember a truth too easily forgotten. A person's worth is never measured by how they appear when the world is watching, but by what they choose to do in the quiet moments when no one is watching at all.